Hi, everybody. Gene here. Welcome to the Tapping Q&A podcast, where every single week we answer the most common and uncommon questions about tapping and EFT so you can get the most out of your tapping practice, eliminate self-sabotage, and take the action that you want. As a reminder, at the end of August and beginning of September, over the course of 3 different weekends, I am doing my Mastering Art of Delivery training 3 times. So you can sign up for any of those 3 weekends. The 3rd weekend, the timing is specifically for the folks who are in Asia, Australia, and New Zealand. So you don't have to get up in the middle of the night to do the training. I will be up for you. If you use the discount code podcast when you check out, you get half off. Basically, the training is going to teach you exactly how I work with clients and how I tap with myself. As you're going to hear in this interview, it's really important that we get to the root cause, the pattern, the memory. And the art of delivery is about how we do that more effectively and how we unpack that. To sign up for the class and to get more information, all you need to do is go to tappingartofdelivery.com. That's tappingartofdelivery.com. And remember, use the discount code podcast at checkout and you will receive 50% off.
Tapping has outperformed the cognitive behavior therapy, either by accomplishing in fewer sessions or in actually having improvements that are greater than the cognitive behavior therapy showed.
This is Gene Montrose-Stelling. Welcome to the Tapping Q&A podcast, recorded live to tape from Williamsburg in Brooklyn. This is episode 471, originally aired July 21st, 2020. Everyone, I hope this finds you well wherever you are and whatever time of day you're getting a chance to listen to this. Thanks for spending some time with me today. Today, we're going to talk about if tapping works, and you believe that it does, and I believe that it does. We wouldn't be here otherwise, but actually talking about how we know that for certain. And in the second part of the conversation, we're going to talk about how tapping actually works. Before we do that, I'd like to thank the sponsors of the Tapping Q&A podcast. Every single week, this podcast comes to you because of those amazing supporters. As supporters, you get a bunch of amazing bonuses. This week, everyone who is a supporter of the podcast received access to the 3 classes that I'm teaching on self-criticism, procrastination, and self-worth over Zoom. They got access to them absolutely free. If you'd like to be a supporter of the podcast to ensure that the podcast keeps coming out in the way that it does and receive amazing gifts and bonuses every single month, like free access to classes, all you need to do is go to tappingqa.com/support. So my conversation today is with David Feinstein, and David and I have been going back and forth over the course of the last few months to figure out what would be the best topic for us to talk about and share with this. And to be honest, when we did the interview, which was a couple of weeks ago, the initial plan in my scheduling for rolling out the podcast is this was going to come out sometime late September, early October. After the conversation, the information is just so valuable inside of this conversation, it doesn't make any sense for us to wait. That I think it's something that it's really important for you to have access to now. If you do not know David, David has published 8 books. He has contributed to over 100 articles and research around tapping and energy medicine and all of that great transformational stuff. He is a true advocate and a truly amazing trainer for those of us who are trying to do better at this. And so here is my conversation with David about how do we know if tapping works and why tapping works. And when we're done, at the other end of the conversation, I want to share something with you that will kind of help connect some of the dots. I have been, over the course of the last month as we were recording this, I've been working on a book. And the book that I was working on and the way it was presented to me is they actually showed up with an outline and said, this is generally what we're trying to do. And they were not people who were expert in tapping, but in the personal development field. And one of the things that I found most interesting in the outline they presented me was they had a huge amount of information that is things that energy practitioners repeat over and over again as if they are true, in which we don't have any real set of grounding for those sorts of things. And someone who is standing outside of any sort of energy work, it's really easy for them to hear stuff like that and just dismiss it because maybe it's something that cozy that fits on a bumper sticker, or it's a cute little quote, but it isn't necessarily grounded in anything that is solid. Like it's these things that we hear so many times that because we've heard them so many times, we think that they're true. As someone who is consistently trying to communicate about this sort of amazing work and trying to communicate that inside of professional circumstances where there are standards of measuring things and getting evidence-based stuff, what is a useful framework for you for us to look at? How do we know if this works, and what are kind of some of the pieces that we need to have in place in order for us to understand that ourselves and then communicate that effectively?
Great question, Gene. When I first learned about energy psychology, it was 2001, and there were zero studies. There was no research. Now there are more than 130 clinical trials, and about half of them are randomized controlled trials. So there's a lot of information that we have that addresses exactly the question that you're asking. Grounded in observation, it's grounded in experimentation, it's grounded in careful review of what happens when people tap. And there's 6 areas that I think are pretty well established that when I got into it in 2001 was really in that speculative woo-woo area where you could say it, claim it, and nobody believed it.
Right.
But now they have to at least take a look at the data, because there is genuine data. And what I've been calling the 6 pillars of energy psychology are very simple, but they're exactly what you were talking about. One pillar is that it works. The second pillar is that it's fast. The third pillar is that the benefits last. The fourth pillar is that tapping impacts the body. A fifth pillar is that tapping changes the brain. And a sixth pillar is that it's the tapping that's making the change. It's not just the words or the focus or the therapeutic relationship or placebo effect. We know those 6 things. So I'll just kind of unpack them one at a time to give you a little bit of a idea of how we know each of those things. So it works. More than 130 clinical trials show that it works, but also there have been a number of meta-analyses, which are where the researchers look at a series of studies and they really try to draw conclusions from a group of studies that you can't draw from just one study. And so it's basically a statistical approach to draw conclusions. And there's been a meta-analysis specifically about tapping and anxiety, one about tapping and depression, one about tapping and PTSD. And in all 3 of those, what's called effect size has been through the roof. There have been really strong effect sizes that shows it works. That shows that people that go through the treatment that have these symptoms have those symptoms significantly reduced or eliminated by the end of the tapping.
From time to time, I will poke my head into the tapping section on Wikipedia and just seeing how things are being talked about in the world. And when you talk about all of those trials, one of the most consistent critiques that the studies that they are citing is that they're not controlled, they're not randomized. How do you respond to someone who would bring up that particular objection?
First of all, Wikipedia is about at 2002 in terms of the research that they really are showing. They don't show the research that exists. While Wikipedia is an authoritative source for many kinds of information, they have been very biased for the most part with holistic healing of any kind. The answer to the criticism that the studies don't have good controls, aren't randomized, is that the more recent studies now are coming out of universities and they are very well designed and they're getting the same results. They're showing the same outcomes. So the early studies were picking up on phenomena that are true, that are really existing there. And even if there were many shortcomings in the designs, which there were. They were still getting accurate. The findings still matched the improvements that people were seeing, and the more sophisticated studies are corroborating that.
Great, excellent.
We have this basis of studies that show that it works. How do we know that it's fast? Well, we see results in just one session. There have been a number of PTSD cures in one session that have been, fairly well researched. Now that I've talked to, there's 3 studies that show a cure in a group of people in one session, not necessarily a cure, but extreme reduction of symptoms, and often lower than the PTSD cutoff. So I've talked to the principal investigators of all 3 studies, and they say, no, we're not saying that you can cure PTSD in one session. It's just that in these 3 studies, they're all outside of the countries where the researchers lived, and so it was for convenience that they had to do a single session. They just were interested in what's going to happen. One of them was trying to do more sessions and it didn't work out. But for the most part, with something as severe as PTSD, 6 to 12 sessions are probably a good amount of time to get tremendous results. And for other things, you see tapping reducing anxiety very quickly. You see many one-session cures of phobia where the person has had a lifetime fear of heights or snakes or whatever, and after one session, it is gone and it does not return. So that evidence of the speed is really quite impressive. So there's been a number of one-session cures, PTSD, and that's almost unheard of. How can that be possible? And I've talked to the principal investigators of all 3 studies that showed this consistent result, that people that had PTSD symptoms, they might have still had some of the symptoms, but they were now below the threshold that the measurements that they were using defined for PTSD. How could that happen in one session? And what the principal investigator said is that, well, it doesn't happen for everybody. And in fact, they would prefer 6 sessions and sometimes up to 12 sessions because it's a very complex mental disorder that's got a lot of dimensions. However, the fact that there have been 3 studies that show single session cures makes you really want to look at it. So another way to look at speed is, how does tapping compare with cognitive behavior therapy, which is the kind of standard of care for many different institutions, the Veterans Administration, et cetera, really look at cognitive behavior therapy as the king of the therapies. And there have been 7 studies now that compare tapping with cognitive behavior therapy for a range of things such as PTSD, anxiety, depression, food cravings. And in each case, the tapping has outperformed the cognitive behavior therapy, either by accomplishing in fewer sessions what was accomplished with a longer number of sessions, or in actually having improvements that are greater than what the cognitive behavior therapy showed. So that really, I think, establishes in a different way that this is a very fast treatment. The third question that you have to ask when there's something that kind of seems magical, like this, is, okay, do the benefits last? Or is the person just sort of put into a state of mind where they feel better, and maybe it's got something to do with the setting or something that's really exciting, but then the symptoms tend not to return. About half the studies that I looked at did follow up, and every one of them showed that the results lasted. Some of them looked at 3 months later, 6 months later, up to 2 years later, the symptoms tended to last. So that's really an important finding, because if the improvements don't last. It's not something that you want to spend a lot of your client's time with. The fourth pillar is that it impacts the body, that you have improvements in fibromyalgia, improvements in pain, improvements in the amount of time it takes for people to heal. And so you've got, we don't know the exact mechanisms for that, but it seems to improve physical conditions. A fifth pillar is that the changes in the brain are quite distinct, that the brain produces less stress hormones when the person is tapping and thinking about something that is very stressful, or it changes gene expression, and it changes specifically genes that have to do with learning and have to do with other psychological functions that are related to people's symptoms. So we have these changes in the body and specifically in the brain. You see brainwave patterns change, normalize in people that are disturbed. So that's the fifth pillar, is the changes in the brain. And the sixth pillar is a question that is really kind of plagued the energy psychology field, is that people say, okay, now there's enough studies that we're convinced that it works, but we don't think it's the tapping, because that doesn't make any sense. It looks silly. There's, how could this possibly be that tapping on the skin helps to reduce PTSD? So there have been 6 studies that have looked at that, and each one of them, in its own way, has found that tapping is an essential ingredient for the speed and thoroughness that we're seeing. So you have one study where you use an EFT protocol, exactly the way it's used in most research studies, and then another group gets that same protocol except no tapping. And instead of the tapping, they might do diaphragmatic breathing, or they might, even more convincing, is they do tapping, but they don't tap on acupuncture points. They tap on what's called sham points. So those 6 studies, which have been submitted to a meta-analysis, all show that the tapping is an essential ingredient for the kinds of results that we're seeing. So those are the 6 pillars. It works, it's fast, the benefits last, it impacts the body, it impacts the brain, and it is the tapping.
So inside of that, what are you seeing, or what do you understand as the mechanism for the change?
That's the magic question, is how can it possibly be that tapping on the skin creates these profound psychological changes? And here's a few things that we know about that. One is that tapping on the skin creates electrical signals. There's something called mechanosensory stimulation, where tapping on the skin actually winds up creating electrical impulses. Now, how do those electrical signals get to the brain? It turns out that there are, in the connective tissue, pathways that correspond with what the Chinese called meridians. They're very hard to detect. They're all mixed in with the connective tissue, but the connective tissue turns out to have a lot of collagen, which is a semiconductor. So it conducts electricity. So these pathways are sending electricity to the brain, electrical signals. And there was a very interesting series of studies. They did it over 10 years at Harvard Medical School. They were looking at the way that different acupuncture points affect the body. And they were using sophisticated equipment like fMRIs and other, PET scans and other ways of really seeing what's happening in the brain in particular. And they found that stimulating certain points, they were doing it either with acupuncture needles, or it turns out that tapping does the same thing. It also sends signals. And they found that certain points that are frequently used reduce arousal in the amygdala. And that's an incredibly important finding for those of us in energy psychology, because if tapping on the skin while you are imagining something that's stressful sends a signal that reduces the distress that you're feeling, you're able to still have that memory or that fantasy or that fearful image, without the brain going into the threat response. The amygdala manages the threat response. It initiates the fight, flight, freeze response. So you have a very interesting sequence here. The therapist says, think about, talk about, and that uh, imagination can literally create the same response in the brain as the actual situation. And so the amygdala goes into at least the start of a threat response. And at the same time, the tapping on the skin is sending signals that reduce the distress. So the body is getting opposing messages, getting a message that puts it into arousal of fear, and a message that reduces the arousal of fear. And you tap for a little while, and that begins to dominate, so that the brain really has no choice, because it's like turning on a faucet will empty the basin. So the distress is decreased, and the memory can still be there, or the fantasy or the image can still be there. And that's a really, I mean, that when I first learned of those studies, I thought, that explains it. That is what is going on in tapping, but it's not enough. It turns out that why would it last? So you imagine being at the edge of a cliff, and your fear of heights gets plugged in, and then you tap and it goes away because the tapping reduced the arousal in the amygdala. But why wouldn't it just be there the next time you're at the edge of a cliff, or the next time that there's something that triggers your fear of heights? So so I thought that was the answer, but then I realized, no, it's the why does it last? That needs to be explained. And that's actually a lot more complicated to explain. This was a mystery for a while, and then I learned about a research program that has actually been going on pretty actively since the 1990s, but it wasn't until a few years into working with energy psychology that I really learned about reconsolidation. And memory reconsolidation is something that has really kind of turned neurology on its head, because we used to believe that you would have a memory, and that memory kind of stayed intact, and it was kind of like putting a DVD into the DVD player when you would access that memory. And then after you were done with that memory, you would put it back into some storage place where it wasn't active, but it could be brought back at any time. But having the memory didn't change the memory, it was believed. Well, memory reconsolidation showed that actually the memory can be changed. The memory can be changed by simply activating it if something very interesting happens. And that is that while the memory is active, an experience that contradicts the memory has to happen. Something that contradicts what that memory predicts. And when I say memory, it's actually a cluster of memories that form an inner model. So it's your inner model about heights or about snakes or about whatever the issue is. And that model predicts things. That model predicts that a snake is going to hurt me, or a height is really dangerous, and I'm already feeling what it's like to be falling. And so I'm in that experience. So if you can have the experience, activate the fear or whatever the aversive experience is, inner experience is, whatever the emotion is, jealousy or anger or whatever it is, and at the same time you are able to reduce the arousal that trigger causes, then you have this surprise that I'm sure you've seen thousands of times in your clients, where they can't believe that they're thinking of whatever it is that has triggered them for their whole life, and they're not feeling scared, they're not feeling arousal. And when that occurs, that's when the whole model changes, so that it's because this is the most recent experience, and it's a powerful experience that demonstrates to the brain that the old model is not accurate, that the old model is out of date. And this is how nature has designed our brain, so that we can update it. We don't update old learnings easily because they're usually based on survival, but there is a way that these old learnings can be updated very rapidly.
But the way I've always described it, not knowing this specifically, but just kind of like from my experience with my clients, is the goal is to create a proportionate, well-informed emotional response. Mm-hmm. And so I'm sitting here. This is people who listen to the podcast. This is the examples I use all the time. But like me sitting in my apartment here in Brooklyn, it's good that I'm afraid of lions. And if I never left my apartment because there's one 4.5 miles away in Central Park, that is a disproportionate emotional response. And so what you're saying is, as we go through this process of memory consolidation, I bring up that fear. We bring in the new information that's saying, yes, lions are dangerous, but at 4.5 miles away, there's absolutely nothing you can do to them. As you say that, I think about the two other types of modalities that I have seen to be really interesting and as useful as tapping, one being hypnosis and the other being theophostic prayer. And what's interesting as you describe this and this idea of consolidating memories, in both of those cases, what happens is we access something that is painful and then we bring new information to it. Oftentimes in hypnosis, it's through some sort of imagery where it's not a direct piece of information, but we're changing the metaphorical information that the subconscious mind is bringing. In something like theophostic prayer, we're bringing in this loving force of God into this space that's saying, no, what you think about yourself as not being worthy is untrue, because the Creator says you are worthy of love because that's the way you've been made. And so the tapping is a really practical physical experience where we're creating that charge through the collagen in the body, where the other two, one's coming in through the mind, the other's coming in through the spirit. But in all three circumstances, it matches exactly the model that you have just described here, and the reason why it's creating transformation in the moment, and the reason why it's something that is lasting. And it's not just placating me the way an aspirin would placate pain, but it's transforming the way my model, so the next time I encounter it, I process it in a different way.
Beautiful. Exactly. And Bruce Ecker, who has really been quite controversial, because what he's been saying is that all therapies that are effective involve this reconsolidation process. He has looked at a whole variety of therapies and shown where it is that they are able to create what neurologists call a prediction error, where the model incorrectly predicts what's going to happen next. And that's a critical step for deep, lasting change, according to Ecker and according to a lot of the memory reconsolidation people. So tapping, though, of all the therapies that I know of, is cheating. it's almost like cheating. It's so simple. You don't have to understand it. You don't have to be creative,
Right.
particularly. It's like in the other therapies, you have to be so creative.
Yeah. And I like the vocabulary I use when thinking about those things is I like to think about it as a constellation of emotions. Like it shows up as this thing that is a constellation. And the beautiful thing about tapping at such gentle protocols, we can literally just take one star at a time inside of the constellation. And instead of trying to deal with the mass, just deal with them at once. And as you know from your experiences, oftentimes I think I'm taking care of one piece of the constellation. I'm actually taking care of two or three, but only needing that one as the entry point because I'm providing the information for all of those pieces, even though I'm focusing on one of those pieces, which makes it even more powerful and quicker because of the way that we're picking off those pieces.
Yes, I love the way it generalizes.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, great. David, thank you very much for your time. I think this becomes useful in two ways. One, it becomes really useful for us as tappers working with clients working on our own to give us a framework to understand the work that we're doing. Because if we understand how and why we think it works, it's easier to repeat that particular thing. The second thing I think is so powerful about this is we're equipping people to have the vocabulary so that we're talking to people who are skeptical. We are able to talk in practical, real, neurological ways that is not stuff that just feels so crazy that it just is difficult to believe. Because we live in a time that we're so marketed to that if something is too good to be true, we just automatically assume that that is the case. And so when something is really, really good, we actually need more proof, not less, so we can get past that bias. So having this framework is super, super useful. So thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure, Gene. Really, really good to talk to you.
I hope you found that conversation as useful as I did, being able to share in a clear, concise way what is going on when we're tapping is such a valuable thing, because I am sure you have been in the exact same situation that I've been in, where trying to explain tapping in some sort of coherent way, they just start to look at you like you have three heads, or as if you're speaking some language that you're just making up on the spot. And so being able to talk in concrete ways, particularly to an audience that really isn't engaged in this sort of transformational work, is going to make it easier for them to understand. And I think it's important to recognize our goal when we are sharing tapping sometimes isn't necessarily to convince someone that tapping works or to even get them to try it. But instead, we are providing them one more opportunity to engage with tapping so that the next time someone brings it up, they already have a little more information. And the time after that, they have a little more information. There have been lots of people in my life who have seen me be very successful at tapping in my own life, know about my clients' success, but it took a certain amount of time before they were willing to say yes and really drive in and try and learn it. And so know that when we're sharing information like this, what we're doing is we're sowing seeds, which will make it easier for someone to say yes. The other thing that we just kind of glance over in this, which shouldn't just be glanced over, is as we were talking about memory consolidation, basically we're talking about we need to tune into the memory and then we need to bring information to it so we can transform that information as we are down-regulating the emotion by tapping. That is what we call the art of delivery. And just because we know we want to bring new information to that spot doesn't mean that we're necessarily skillful at that. The training that I am running, the art of delivery, teaches you exactly how to do that. It teaches you, basically from the last 13 years of my experience of working with clients, how and why I do what I do so I can get to root causes very quickly. And these are tools I use every single day when I'm tapping on my own for my own issues. This isn't just about working with other people. It's useful to have these skills when doing it, but we can use these exact same skills with ourselves as we are navigating our own tapping process. If you go to tappingartofdelivery.com, you can find all of the information on the program. And if you use the discount code podcast, you will receive 50% off of the training. Tappingartofdelivery.com. Use the discount code podcast to get 50% off. If you have any questions about the training, please reach out. Gene, Gene, at tappingqa.com. We've already had a whole bunch of people sign up for it. The content is so good. I haven't been this excited about a training or a product launch in a really long time. I haven't done a training like this in 9 years, something this comprehensive, and I'm not exactly sure when I'm going to do it again. So you really want to take advantage of it now. tappingartofdelivery.com. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe to the podcast. In podcasting parlance, subscribe is always free. It's not like Netflix or Hulu where you're paying a monthly fee. It is free. You can find the show in Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Pandora, Spotify, radio.com, Deezer, Stitcher, anywhere you find audio. Just search for Tapping Q&A and you can find the show. Click subscribe, click follow so that when new episodes come out, you're notified right away and you don't miss the great information like this conversation we just had with David. If you have a topic or a suggestion for a future show, please reach out. Gene, Gene, at tappingqa.com. If you're on the website, you can just click that contact link. And if you have questions about anything or if you just want to reach out and say hi, I would love to hear from you. I get all of those emails. For the Tapping Q&A podcast, this is Gene Montrestelli. I hope you have a great day, and I will talk to you real soon. Bye-bye. The Tapping Q&A podcast is copyright Gene Montrestelli Tapping Q&A. All views expressed by guests are those of the guests and not necessarily of Gene Montrestelli and Tapping Q&A.